A gang leader believed that ambushing a royal guard would cement his reputation, but within moments, a single devastating move left him and his entire crew on the ground, defeated and disgraced. Here's how it all went down. Before we jump in, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and be sure to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow, at this exact time, we're bringing you another unforgettable story of the Royal Guard's strength and discipline. You won't want to miss it. The golden hour cast long shadows across the courtyard of Buckingham Palace as tourists shuffled about with their cameras, snapping photos of the stoic figures in scarlet tunics. Among them stood Guardsman James Harrison, a man whose stillness spoke volumes about the discipline carved into his very bones. His eyes, though fixed ahead in the traditional 1,000-yard stare, missed nothing. The restless movement of a pickpocket near the gates, the nervous energy of a woman clutching her purse too tightly, and most importantly, the 5 figures in dark hoodies who had been circling the perimeter for the past 20 minutes. Harrison had learned to read danger the way others read morning newspapers, quickly, thoroughly, and with an understanding that information could mean the difference between life and death. His time in Helmand Province had taught him that threats rarely announced themselves with fanfare. They crept in wearing ordinary faces, speaking in hushed tones, moving with the calculated patience of predators. These 5 had that same energy, that same predatory rhythm that made the hair on the back of his neck stand at attention. The leader of the group, a man in his mid-20s with a spiderweb tattoo crawling up his neck like black ink bleeding through parchment, had been eyeing Harrison for the better part of an hour. Dev King Carter, though Harrison didn't know his name yet, had the swagger of someone who had never met real consequence. His crew followed his lead with the blind loyalty of men who had mistaken brutality for strength, chaos for power. Tourism had been particularly heavy that day, with school groups from across Europe mingling with families from America and Asia. The usual suspects were there too, the street performers hoping for loose change, the souvenir vendors hawking miniature guards and plastic crowns, and the ever-present pickpockets who saw crowds as opportunities rather than obstacles. But these 5 were different. They moved with purpose, their eyes constantly returning to Harrison as if he were a puzzle they were determined to solve. The first sign of real trouble came when Dev spat on the pristine pavement just 10 feet from Harrison's post. It wasn't the act itself that raised alarm bells. London had seen far worse displays of disrespect, but the deliberate nature of it. This wasn't casual discourtesy. It was a test. Dev was probing, seeing how far he could push before the immovable object would move. Harrison's training kicked in automatically. His peripheral vision expanded, cataloging exit routes, potential weapons, and civilian positions. A family with 3 young children stood dangerously close to what would soon become a battleground. An elderly couple sat on a nearby bench, completely oblivious to the tension building around them. A tour guide was explaining the history of the guard rotation to a group of university students, her voice carrying clearly in the crisp evening air. Dev's crew had positioned themselves strategically, though they probably didn't realize it. Street thugs often moved by instinct rather than training, but sometimes instinct and tactical positioning aligned by accident. 2 flanked Harrison's left side, staying just outside his immediate striking range. 1 lingered behind the growing crowd of tourists, cutting off potential escape routes. The 5th member, a wiry kid who couldn't have been more than 19, had positioned himself near the palace gates, probably thinking he was watching Harrison's back but actually creating a perfect choke point. The spiderweb tattoo on Dev's neck told a story Harrison had seen before: prison ink, applied with makeshift needles and smuggled pigment. The web was incomplete, traditional among certain gangs to indicate unfinished business or pending revenge. Dev's hands showed the calluses of someone who worked with tools, but not the kind you'd find in an honest trade. These were the marks of someone who specialized in violence, whose hands had shaped themselves around weapons rather than productive instruments. Harrison had encountered men like Dev in the mountains of Afghanistan, where local warlords recruited young men with promises of power and respect. The faces changed, the geography shifted, but the underlying psychology remained consistent. These were men who had never learned to build anything, so they had dedicated themselves to tearing things down instead. They measured their worth in the fear they could generate, the damage they could inflict, the chaos they could create. The first verbal provocation came as a whisper that gradually grew bolder. Dev started with muttered comments to his crew, just loud enough for Harrison to hear, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Comments about toy soldiers, about grown men playing dress-up, about what would happen if someone really wanted to test the legendary discipline of the Queen's Guard. A young mother pushing a prom noticed the shift in atmosphere first. She instinctively steered away from the group, her maternal instincts recognizing danger, even when her rational mind hadn't yet processed the threat. An American tourist raised his camera toward the unfolding drama, thinking he was about to capture some colorful London street theater. He had no idea he was about to witness something far more serious. Harrison's breathing remained steady, controlled, but his mind was already running through scenarios. His rifle wasn't loaded. Palace protocols were clear about that, but the bayonet was real, and more importantly, his body was a weapon that had been honed by years of military training. Close-quarters combat wasn't just about overpowering an opponent. It was about efficiency, about ending threats quickly and decisively, while minimizing collateral damage. The memories came unbidden, as they often did during moments of high stress. Helmand Province, 3 years earlier, when Harrison's patrol had been ambushed by Taliban fighters who had underestimated the training and resolve of British forces. That firefight had lasted 17 minutes and ended with 7 insurgents dead and Harrison's squad intact. The lesson hadn't been about superior firepower. The Taliban had actually outnumbered them, but about discipline under pressure, about making the right decisions when everything was chaos. Dev's crew was getting restless. Street violence operated on its own timeline, building tension until it reached a breaking point where action became inevitable. Harrison could feel that point approaching like a storm front, the air itself seeming to thicken with anticipation. The tourists were beginning to sense it too, that primitive awareness that danger was near, even when they couldn't identify its source. The shift from posturing to action happened in the space between heartbeats. Dev pulled out a switchblade, not to use immediately, but to display it, to let Harrison know that this wasn't going to be a simple fistfight. The blade caught the dying sunlight, throwing brief flashes of reflected light across the courtyard like a deadly Morse code. Harrison's training had taught him to read weapons, the way musicians read sheet music quickly, instinctively, understanding not just what they were but how they would be used. The switchblade was cheap, mass-produced, the kind of knife that street thugs favored because it looked impressive but broke easily under stress. More importantly, Dev held it wrong, like someone who had watched too many movies and not enough real combat. His grip was too tight, his stance too rigid, his movements too telegraphed. The other 4 crew members revealed their own weapons, with the theatrical flair of men who thought intimidation was more important than effectiveness. Brass knuckles, a chain, another knife, and what looked like a homemade blackjack filled with ball bearings. Street weapons, improvised and crude, carried by men who had learned violence in alleys and prison yards, rather than professional training facilities. A security camera mounted on a nearby lamppost captured everything. Though Harrison wasn't thinking about documentation in that moment, his focus had narrowed to the immediate threat, his awareness expanding to encompass every variable that might affect the outcome of what was about to happen. Wind direction, ground conditions, civilian positions, escape routes, backup response, times, all of it processed automatically by a mind that had been trained to function under extreme stress. The crowd was beginning to realize that something was wrong. The universal human ability to sense violence before it erupted was kicking in, causing people to step back, to look around nervously, to reach for their phones. A few tourists started taking pictures, still not understanding that they were about to witness something far more serious than a staged performance. Dev's voice carried clearly across the courtyard when he finally spoke directly to Harrison. The words were crude, designed to provoke rather than communicate, filled with the kind of toxic masculinity that confused aggression with strength. He questioned Harrison's courage, his manhood, his right to stand there in that uniform, representing something larger than himself. Harrison's response came not in words but in posture, a subtle shift in his stance, barely perceptible to the untrained eye, but significant to anyone who understood military bearing. His weight distributed more evenly, his center of gravity lowered slightly, his muscles coiled like springs ready to release explosive energy. To the casual observer, he still looked like a statue, but to Dev's crew, something fundamental had changed. The psychological dynamics of the confrontation were shifting. What had started as 5 predators stalking what they assumed was easy prey was becoming something else entirely. Harrison's absolute stillness, his refusal to be baited or intimidated, was having an effect that Dev hadn't anticipated. Doubt was creeping into the equation, though none of the gang members would have admitted it. Street fighters relied on fear and intimidation to establish dominance before physical contact ever began. They were used to victims who cowered, who begged, who tried to negotiate their way out of violence. Harrison's complete lack of reaction was disrupting their playbook, forcing them to confront the possibility that they had misjudged their target. A group of schoolchildren on a field trip was shepherded away by their teacher, who had recognized the signs of impending violence with the instincts of someone who had worked in London's public school system for 2 decades. The elderly couple on the bench remained oblivious, their conversation about their grandchildren continuing even as danger circled around them. Harrison's military experience had taught him that violence, when it became inevitable, should be swift and decisive. Half measures led to prolonged conflicts, increased injury, and greater danger to civilians. The goal wasn't to fight fairly, it was to neutralize the threat as quickly and efficiently as possible, using whatever means necessary to restore safety. And Dev was working himself up to the moment of action, his breathing becoming more rapid, his movements more erratic. Gang psychology demanded that he follow through on his threats, that he prove his dominance in front of his crew and the growing audience of tourists. To back down now would mean losing face, losing respect, losing the fear-based authority that held his crew together. The attack, when it finally came, was both sudden and predictable. Dev lunged forward with his switchblade extended, aiming for Harrison's torso in a wild, undisciplined strike that prioritized speed over accuracy. His crew moved simultaneously, converging from multiple angles in what they probably thought was a coordinated assault, but which actually created as many problems as opportunities. Harrison's response was instantaneous and devastating. Years of training compressed into a handful of seconds as he demonstrated why professional soldiers were different from street fighters. His rifle butt snapped upward in a precise arc, connecting with Dev's wrist with enough force to shatter bone and send the switchblade spinning away across the courtyard. The sound of breaking bone was audible, even over the gasps and screams of the watching tourists. Dev's scream of pain and surprise echoed off the palace walls as his knife hand became suddenly, violently useless. But Harrison wasn't finished. Before Dev could process what had happened to his wrist, Harrison's boot connected with his kneecap, in a move that combined military combat training with the brutal efficiency of someone who understood anatomy. The kneecap, a relatively small bone that bears tremendous weight and stress, is also remarkably fragile when struck from the correct angle with sufficient force. Harrison's boot connected with surgical precision, not just breaking the bone but displacing it in a way that would require multiple surgeries and months of rehabilitation to repair. Dev collapsed immediately, his leg no longer capable of supporting his weight. 2 of Dev's crew members hesitated, suddenly confronted with the reality that their victim was fighting back with professional skill and devastating effectiveness. That moment of hesitation was all Harrison needed to demonstrate why the Household Division's training went far beyond ceremonial duties. The second attacker, wielding brass knuckles, found himself on the receiving end of a palm strike to the nose that broke cartilage and sent blood streaming down his face, while simultaneously causing his eyes to water so badly that he could no longer see his target. The third discovered that chains, while intimidating, were useless against someone who understood leverage and momentum, as Harrison used the weapon's own weight against its wielder to dislocate his shoulder. The fourth crew member, seeing 3 of his associates down and bleeding, made the intelligent decision to run. Unfortunately for him, Harrison's training included pursuit and apprehension techniques. A perfectly executed leg sweep sent the would-be escapee sprawling across the pavement, where he remained, more from shock than injury, though his scraped palms and bruised ego would remind him of this encounter for weeks to come. The fifth and final attacker, the young one who had positioned himself near the gates, froze in place as he watched his crew systematically dismantled by a man who hadn't even broken his military bearing. This was his first real taste of violence, and the reality was nothing like the movies or video games that had shaped his expectations. Real combat was brutal, quick, and decisive. There were no dramatic speeches, no extended fight sequences, no opportunity for clever comebacks. Harrison's demonstration of professional violence had taken less than 30 seconds from start to finish. 11 seconds of actual combat, bookended by moments of positioning and assessment. In that brief span of time, he had neutralized 5 attackers without suffering so much as a torn uniform or displaced piece of equipment. His bearskin hat remained perfectly positioned, his rifle properly held, his posture maintaining the same rigid military bearing that had characterized his stance before the attack began. The tourists who had witnessed the encounter stood in stunned silence, their cameras and phones capturing the aftermath of something they had never expected to see. The contrast was stark and unsettling. A man in a ceremonial uniform, who had just demonstrated the very real violence that his training represented, standing calmly among groaning, bleeding attackers as if nothing significant had happened. Emergency. Sirens were already approaching, called by witnesses who had recognized that this was beyond ordinary street violence. Police, ambulances, and additional security personnel would arrive within minutes, but Harrison had already contained and neutralized the threat. His job now was to maintain security and provide a clear, factual account of what had transpired. Dev writhed on the ground, his broken wrist cradled against his chest, while his shattered kneecap made any movement of his leg an exercise in agony. The spiderweb tattoo on his neck seemed somehow smaller now, less intimidating, as if the violence he had initiated had diminished rather than enhanced his reputation. The first police officer to arrive on the scene was Constable Sarah Mitchell, a 10-year veteran who had seen her share of street violence but had never encountered anything quite like this. The scene before her was simultaneously chaotic and orderly. 5 injured suspects, dozens of witnesses, and one completely composed guardsman who looked as if he had just finished a routine patrol rather than a life-or-death confrontation. Harrison's report was precise, factual, and delivered. In the clipped, professional tone that military training instilled, he identified each attacker by their position and the weapons they had carried, described the sequence of events without editorial comment, and provided a clear timeline that could be verified by the security cameras that had captured the entire incident. The medical response was swift and professional. Paramedics worked to stabilize Dev's injuries while police photographers documented the scene and collected evidence. The switchblade lay where it had fallen, its blade still extended, a physical reminder of the violence that had been intended but ultimately redirected back onto its perpetrators. Witness statements painted a consistent picture of unprovoked aggression met with restrained but decisive force. The American tourist who had been filming showed his footage to investigators, providing multiple angles of an encounter that would soon become viral on social media platforms around the world. Harrison's commanding officer arrived as the scene was being secured, his expression a mixture of concern and professional pride. Incidents involving the Queen's Guard were rare, but when they occurred, they were handled with the same precision and attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the regiment's operations. The investigation would be thorough but straightforward. Security cameras, witness testimony, and physical evidence all supported the same conclusion. 5 armed attackers had assaulted a member of the Queen's Guard and had been neutralized using appropriate force. The fact that Harrison had managed to subdue all 5 without causing permanent disability or death would be noted as evidence of his professional restraint and superior training. Word of the incident spread rapidly through both official channels and social media. The hashtag #GuardianAngel began trending within hours. As video footage of the encounter was shared and reshared across platforms, commentary ranged from admiration for Harrison's skill and restraint to broader discussions about violence, security, and the role of ceremonial military units in modern society. Dev's crew, those who were conscious enough to understand their situation, found themselves facing serious charges: assault with a deadly weapon, disturbing the peace, and attacking a member of the military were just the beginning of their legal troubles. Their previous criminal records, which included everything from petty theft to aggravated assault, meant that this incident would likely result in significant prison sentences. The Steel Kings, as Dev's gang called themselves, had built their reputation on intimidating tourists and locals who seemed vulnerable. Their previous victims had included elderly tourists, lone women, and anyone who appeared unlikely to fight back effectively. They had never encountered professional violence before, and the experience had shattered their confidence, along with their bones. Harrison's background check, conducted as part of the standard investigation, revealed a decorated military career that included service in Afghanistan, advanced combat training, and commendations for both courage and restraint under fire. His psychological evaluation, updated annually as part of his duties with the Queen's Guard, showed a stable, disciplined individual with exceptional stress management capabilities. The incident report would become required reading at military training facilities, not because of the violence involved, but because of the restraint Harrison had shown. Despite being outnumbered 5-1 and facing multiple weapons, he had used only the minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. None of his attackers had suffered life-threatening injuries, though several would require extensive medical treatment and rehabilitation. Media coverage focused on the contrast between ceremonial duty and combat readiness, exploring how the Queen's Guard represented both British tradition and very real military capability. Harrison declined all interview requests, maintaining the professional discretion that his position required, but his actions spoke louder than any words could have. The aftermath of the incident extended far beyond the immediate medical and legal consequences. Tourism increased around Buckingham Palace as people hoped to catch a glimpse of the guardsman who had become an overnight sensation. Additional security measures were implemented, though more as a precaution than from any specific threat assessment. Dev's recovery would be long and painful. His wrist required surgery to repair the shattered bones, and his kneecap would never fully heal. The permanent limp he would carry served as a daily reminder of the night he had mistaken ceremony for weakness, tradition for vulnerability. His crew disbanded after their release from the hospital, their reputation shattered along with their confidence. Harrison returned to duty the following day, his routine unchanged by his brief moment of fame. He stood at his post with the same unwavering discipline, the same professional bearing, the same absolute commitment to his duty that had characterized his service before the incident. The only difference was the increased respect in the eyes of his fellow guardsmen and the knowledge that he had upheld the highest traditions of his regiment. The incident became a case study in military academies around the world, demonstrating how proper training and discipline could transform a potentially tragic situation into a textbook example of professional force application. Harrison's 11 seconds of combat action were analyzed frame by frame, not to glorify violence but to understand how training, positioning, and mental preparation could overcome numerical disadvantage and superior weaponry. The young gang member, who had frozen during the attack, later turned himself in to police and cooperated fully with the investigation. The encounter had served as a wake-up call, showing him a glimpse of where his life was heading if he continued down the path of street violence. He eventually joined a community outreach program and became an advocate for youth intervention services. Years later, security footage of the incident would still be used in training programs, though not for the reasons one might expect. Rather than focusing on the combat techniques Harrison had employed, instructors used the video to demonstrate restraint, professionalism, and the importance of maintaining discipline even in the face of extreme provocation. The true lesson of that evening wasn't about superior fighting ability or military training. It was about the difference between violence and force, between brutality and discipline, between chaos and control. Harrison had faced a situation that could have escalated into tragedy, and had managed it with the precision and restraint that marked him as a true professional. Dev never fully recovered from his injuries, but he did eventually find a different path. His encounter with Harrison had shown him the difference between real strength and the artificial power that came from intimidating others. He served his prison sentence quietly, spent his time learning a trade, and emerged as someone fundamentally changed by those 11 seconds that had altered the trajectory of his life. The incident joined the annals of military history, not as a tale of violence, but as an example of how proper training, discipline, and restraint could transform a dangerous situation into a demonstration of professional excellence. Harrison's actions that evening embodied the highest ideals of military service: protecting others, maintaining order, and using force only when necessary and only to the extent required. The golden hour light that had illuminated the beginning of the encounter had given way to darkness by the time the scene was cleared and normal operations resumed. But the memory of those few minutes would endure, a reminder that behind the ceremony and tradition stood individuals prepared to face whatever threats might emerge from the shadows of even the most civilized society. In the end, the story wasn't about a fight at all. It was about the meeting of two different worlds, one built on discipline, training, and service to something greater than oneself, and another founded on intimidation, violence, and the pursuit of power over others. When those worlds collided, there was never really any doubt about which would prevail. The only surprise was how decisively and professionally that victory would be achieved.